In the spring of 1851, when dust still lifted easily from the unpaved streets of Coloma and the South Fork of the American River ran low between its cobbled banks, Thomas Reed assumed his time that would be temporary. He had come west in 1849 from Ohio, one of many who read the first reports east of the Mississippi and believed that endurance, rather than restraint, determined success. Too young to inherit land and confident that effort would eventually be rewarded, he lived his early months under borrowed canvas and rough pine shelters, washing gravel from first light until dusk alongside men whose names he learned once and never heard again. Claims shifted hands without ceremony, ownership often asserted only by continued presence or the hurried posting of notice. Whatever Thomas earned vanished quickly into iron picks, stamped shovels, and a better pan, all priced to reflect the long haul from the coast. When he finally stepped away from mining, it was not because he had failed to work, but because he sensed that chance had replaced labor and that the river no longer responded to persistence in a way he had been taught to trust. By the end of that same year, the shallow bars nearest Coloma were visibly thinned, and with them Thomas's patience for speculation. It was then that he accepted steady work at the general store run by Samuel Whitaker, a man old enough to have witnessed the first discoveries along the American River in early 1848 and cautious enough to understand how narrow that window had been. Whitaker sold flour by the sack, dried beans, salt pork, lamp oil, and nails brought inland from Sacramento by wagon and riverboat, extending credit to men whose need was immediate and whose prospects were increasingly uncertain. Each purchase was recorded by hand in a bound ledger kept behind the counter, balances carried forward month after month, sometimes with little expectation of settlement. The store itself, plain, clapboard, and sturdily framed, stood out in a town still marked by tents, brush shelters, and temporary sheds. It represented a decision to remain. Thomas slept in a narrow room at the rear, surrounded by stacked crates and the persistent odor of grain and kerosene, and began to see that Coloma was no longer sustained by anticipation, but by the quieter discipline of maintenance. Mary Whitaker, Samuel's daughter, had come to the foothills before the rush reached its height and had watched the town expand and contract in quick succession. At 20, she assisted with the store's accounts and insisted on precision even as defaults multiplied. Accuracy, she believed, was a form of order when other structures were eroding. To abandon the effort, to let the books slide into approximation, was to concede that the town itself was provisional. She accepted hardship as a condition of life in Coloma, but she resisted the temptation to imagine that the early abundance could be restored. The past, to her, was not a promise but a measure. By about 1854, when the easily worked river claims in the immediate vicinity were largely exhausted, the change came without announcement. Cabins that had taken months to raise were dismantled board by board. Hardware pulled free before families moved on to newer fields upriver or northward. The ring of hammers gave way to the creak of wagon wheels heading down the road. Margaret Doyle, an Irish widow who supported her 2 children by running a boarding house, saw vacant bunks for the first time since opening her doors. Like many others, she faced a clear choice: close and seek wages elsewhere, or remain in a place that no longer promised advancement. She stayed, not from optimism, but from conviction, leaving at the first contraction. She believed would teach her children that difficulty was something to be avoided rather than endured. The tension that settled over Coloma was rarely spoken aloud, yet it shaped daily decisions. To stay meant accepting lower returns and longer hours, without the excitement that had drawn people west. To leave meant acknowledging that the original promise had been larger than the land could sustain. Thomas confronted this choice when a letter arrived from his brother, now following reports of a new strike farther north, urging him to sell what little he had and begin again. For several nights, he weighed the prospect against the obligations he now felt, to the store, to the Whitakers, to the modest stability he had achieved. When he declined, he felt no triumph, only a settled calm, as if he had chosen something that did not depend on fortune. By the end of the decade, Coloma no longer appeared in national mining reports, yet it persisted in reduced form. A small schoolhouse operated during the winter months. Garden plots edged up the foothills where the soil allowed. Sutter's mill remained standing, little altered, a reminder of an origin that could not be repeated. Thomas married Mary, and as Samuel's health declined, they assumed responsibility for the store, maintaining its ledgers even as trade slowed. Margaret Doyle accumulated little beyond necessity, but she raised her children with enough steadiness that one later found work teaching in the county. None of them found gold. Each acquired something less visible and more durable. Coloma did not collapse, it adjusted. The streets grew quieter, but they remained passable. Memory began to outweigh expectation. Success came to be measured not by sudden accumulation, but by the ability to remain upright through disappointment. When travelers asked what had become of the gold, the answer was no longer in the riverbed, but in the lives that remained after the promise had faded. The lesson the town offered was neither triumphant nor tragic. It was endurance, an understanding that expansion had brought Coloma into being. But responsibility kept it alive, leaving behind not a footnote, but a human record of restraint, loyalty, and the practical wisdom of knowing when to stop pursuing and begin maintaining what one has built. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video. It helps these quiet, often forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered, but we'd also love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans across countries, generations, and experiences, all connected by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.